There's a verse I thought we would look at today. But to appreciate it and properly explore its meaning, I think it's important to look at the preceding verse. So we're going to look at the two verses together. And the second one is going to be the primary one I want to focus on. I thought what we would do today, I don't really do as much anymore because we're online a lot, is I thought we would discuss the verse as a group, which means I'm going to ask you guys for feedback at the outset. So we should listen up, listen carefully. I think she needs help, Shri. Go help her, Shri. So yeah, I'm going to ask you guys to explore the meaning of the verse with me. And so let's pay attention. The first verse is Abhyasa yoga yuktena cetasa nanya gamina. Abhyasa yoga yuktena cetasa nanya gamina. With your mind not focused on anything else. Cetasa means with your cetas, with your chitta, with your mind. Na anya gamina. Gam means to go. So gamina means going. With it going, na anya, not to another place. Cetasa nanya gamina. With your mind not going to another place. Abhyasa yoga yuktena. And with that same mind, yoked through practice to yoga, which of course yoga and yukta are the same word. So yukta means yogad. So yogad with practice to yoga. With your mind yogad to yoga through practice, and with that mind not going anywhere else. It's a positive and a negative. What are you doing? You're yogging your mind to yoga, and what you're not doing is not going anywhere else. Paramam Purusham Divyam. Paramam Purusham Divyam Yati. You will go to the Supreme Divine Being. Paramam, Supreme. Purusham, person. Divyam, transcendental. Purusha in Sanskrit means male, primarily. Like if you go and you see a bathroom in India and it's for men, the door of the bathroom will say Purush. Purush and Stri. Male and female. So the word Purush nowadays in Sanskrit-derived languages primarily means male to such an extent that when you want to designate a bathroom as being for men, it'll say Purush on it. It's the same word here. The word Purusha also means person, similar to how you can talk about man's quest for knowledge. And it doesn't simply mean the quest of male participants of the human species for knowledge, but rather it means all of mankind, which again includes both women and men. So Purusha, although it literally means male, as distinguished from and contrasted to female, it also means mankind, similar to how the English word man means both male as well as humankind. And then Purusha also means God. So the word has three usages in Sanskrit, depending on the context. And the word Paramam, supreme divine being. So it becomes like an adjective modifying the person. And so now it's the supreme person. So just like if you were to say the supreme being in English, sometimes they'll do this for kings, like I think the North Korean dictator is called the supreme leader. Sometimes you'll use that word supreme when you're talking about a dictator in his home country. It's part of his honorific. But if you really think about supreme, we do stuff like we capitalize words. So if we say supreme being with a capital S and a capital B, then it's clear that you're talking about God. But you're talking about a personal conception of God, not a conception of God where God is a force or an energy or where everyone is God. The very nature of saying the supreme being means not all beings are supreme. Therefore, you may not be supreme. There is somebody above you, and that somebody above you is a somebody as opposed to just a force, which makes sense because how would we get all of us who are beings from a source which wasn't also an individual and also a being? And so, although it's less popular these days in woke circles to think of God as being a person, it certainly makes a heck of a lot more sense, because how did you get your personhood if you didn't get it from the divine? And how could the divine be lacking that very thing that you have? And of course, being a person is better than being a non-person. People might think it's better than not be a person, but they're just not thinking about it deeply enough. If you think about it deeply enough, there's something special and innate and important about being a person, and you certainly wouldn't want to give up your personhood, because that would suck. You wouldn't be able to love or feel compassion or feel empathy or relate to other people or have loving exchanges or serve or have intimacy if there was only one person who lived in the world and existed. All those things wouldn't be there. And so although we might want to find commonality with other people, and we might want to find synergy with other people, generally speaking, we don't want that to be absolute. We want to have some merging without mushing. And we want to have a way to feel we're of one blood, of one race, of one clan, of one community, without meaning that literally every single person is exactly the same as every other person, and we're all one being, and therefore there's no mother, there's no child, there's no love between them, there's no compassion for those less fortunate yourself, there's no grace for you. And so there's certainly any number of serious, crippling deficiencies that come from an absolute oneness. And you can have all the good stuff that oneness affords without these negative things by postulating a partial oneness, a oneness of desire or essence, so many things that doesn't involve an absolute extinguishing of all individuality. So of course, by calling God the supreme person, the supreme transcendent person, Divya is where you get the word divine from. Paramam Purusham Divyam Anuchintayan. Anuchintayan means constantly thinking. Chinta means thinking. Anuchinta means constantly thinking of somebody. By constantly thinking of the Paramam Purusham Divyam, the supreme divine being, Nanya Gamina, and no other. Abhyasa Yoga Yuktena, by cultivation, by practice, becoming expert at thinking of the supreme being and no other. Then you will go to that supreme being. Yati, you will go to that supreme being. So again, Abhyasa Yoga Yuktena, with your mind Cetasa, with your mind sharpened through constant practice in yoga. Nanya-gamina, and without it deviating at all. Then Paramam Purusham Divyam Anuchintaya, thinking of the Supreme Divine Person, Yati, you will go to that person. Verse is relatively straightforward. When I read this verse, I naturally have an immediate question which arises in my mind. Now, I've read the Gita 1,000 times, so I know all the verses and the preceding verses and the subsequent verses. So I have that advantage. But if I try to imagine that I didn't know what was coming next, I still think that there is a natural question that comes up if you read a verse like this. You're being told to think of the Supreme Divine Being by practice, by cultivation, by not thinking of anything else. So obviously that's going to be work. To not get distracted, it's going to take work, and you're going to practice it. Abhyas means to practice something over and over again. Yuktena, with yoking yourself, so it involves some force, some practice, some cultivation. You got to practice not thinking of the wrong stuff and thinking of the right stuff, and the right stuff is the Supreme Divine Being. And if you do that, then there's a result of that, and the result is you go to that Supreme Divine Being. So the verse is relatively, what I want to say, it's insular and complete in the sense of it makes several points. It describes things positively, negatively. It indicates that there's going to be some practice and some force involved in case it doesn't come easy. It tells you what you're supposed to think about. It tells you what the result of that process is. It's relatively complete, I think. But there is one thing I think that my mind naturally asks. If I read a verse like this, before I move forward, let's go ahead and get some feedback on this verse. What do you guys think of the verse? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Does it have any glaring defects? Does it have any specific good things you've noticed that are thought-provoking and inspirational? Are there any gaping holes in the verse? Does it lead to further questions? This is the kind of feedback I'm looking for. Go. Yeah.
So there is a supreme being, so there is levels in the spiritual plane, or is there, is that what the verse is saying?
The verse is describing a hierarchy. The verse is describing, and actually in the word hierarchy, interestingly enough, in Greek, is hieros arche, sacred order. So the verse is not putting forward the idea that everything is exactly one, but that within that spirit there is a source, there's a supreme being, there's a hierarchy, there is a deity, you are a devotee, love can exist between the devotee and the deity, grace can come down from that deity towards the devotee, and that sometimes seems like a bad idea, because people have wars and there's differences and you want everybody to be one. But then you think about it, if a mother became fully one with her child, that means there would be no child. And then there would be no love between a mother and a child. If everything was fully one, then compassion would be an illusion. Love would be an illusion. Because love is something that binds two people together, but those two people have to be different in order for the love to bind them together. The mother and child have to be different in order for that love to bind them together. You have to be different than the next person in order to feel compassion or empathy for that person. You need to be different from somebody in order to be merciful or kind to them. And so there is some downside of difference, that you view people as being other or us versus them or stuff like that. But that's not necessarily the case. You could consider somebody to be part of your family. You consider the whole world to be part of your family, even including all forms of life. And if you were able to do that, you would have that oneness, that got rid of that division and that exploitation. But then if you got rid of all difference, then you would also get rid of compassion, empathy, sympathy, love, intimacy. And those qualities are usually considered to be the noblest and the best things that exist within the world. And so we wouldn't want to do that. And so this verse preserves that hierarchy and allows there to be some oneness, allows there to be some union. The word yoga means union. Allows there to be a union, but that union does not require you to give up the benefits of also there being a slight difference. Very good, thank you. More feedback, yes.
My first thought is that it seems quite difficult to focus.
Yeah, I thought of that. Hold on. I thought of that. That it seems difficult to focus on nothing else and to focus on the deity. But that's really troubleshot in the verse itself, because it says by practice, by yoking. And so I just right before I asked for feedback, I tried to troubleshoot that for you so you wouldn't go there. Because by saying by practice and by a forceful process of yoking, it does indicate that it's not going to be easy. Give me one sec. It does indicate it's not going to be easy. And so it does already troubleshoot that and anticipate that doubt and just puts its best foot forward and troubleshoots that and tells you it's going to take work. And so to say it seems difficult, yeah, it's also difficult to get a degree. But when they tell you, hey, it's going to be difficult to get your degree, but if you study for X amount of time, you'll be able to get it, then to go, well, that doesn't make sense to me because it seems difficult. Yeah, I already anticipated that. That's why I told you it was going to take practice. Did you follow that?
Yeah.
I see. Does that answer your question? Did you have more?
My question is what happens if I don't do that as a result?
All right, that works. That's a good question. If I can't do it, am I out of luck? Do I have a whole lot of nothing? That's a good question. Excellent question. I saw something over here, yeah.
The verse itself sounds hopeful, like if we really work at something, put our mind to it, we can go to that place.
All right, so the verse is empowering.
Yeah, it's empowering.
And it puts the ball in your court.
Yeah.
It's not automatic. If it's automatic, you go back to heaven, it's called monergism. If you got to be involved in the process, it's called synergism. There's different types of religion in the world. There's monergistic religion and there's synergistic religion. What's his name? Calvin. John Calvin, the famous Protestant theologian. He preached a monergistic worldview, that it was already set who was going back to heaven and who wasn't. The problem with that worldview is it means there's really nothing you can do. And of course it means anybody who doesn't make it back to heaven or goes to hell, who's ultimately at fault for that? God is, because he set the world up where everything's already preordained. So predestination gets real problematic because all the bad stuff in the world all of a sudden becomes God's fault. A synergistic worldview dodges that bullet, that fatal flaw, and it means there's something you have to do. And so if you look at synergistic spiritual traditions, they are empowering. And they put the ball in your court, and they acknowledge your freedom. And of course, any religion that doesn't acknowledge your freedom is a tough sell, because my freedom is kind of pretty easy for me to identify just by looking at my own life. I seem to be able to make choices. And I seem to have the freedom to make choices and choose what I think about and choose what I do with my life. And so a religion that said everything is deterministic would be a real tough sell, because it goes against my basic experience of the world. So this does not have those fatal flaws. It acknowledges your freedom, and in fact it is a call to action, right? Excellent. Okay, more feedback. Hinton? That's a little bit abstract. I mean, so somebody could theoretically go down the road of whatever I have was given to me by that supreme being, therefore there's no real value in me offering anything back. This verse seems to acknowledge that there is some value in offering it back. Hang on, just slow down. You said it, so now it owns you. That's what happens when you open your mouth, is your words own you. That seems a little bit like reaching around your head to touch your nose, right? It just seems a little bit like that, right? So I think another way you could say it was you could say that you at least have the freedom to choose what you think about. You at least have the freedom to choose what you think about. Does that make sense? And so forget introducing the whole idea of giving something back and sacrifice, which isn't part of the verse. If you just look at what's in the verse itself, what's in the verse itself is you have the right to choose what you think about. Does that make sense? And so the same point you want to make, the verse does acknowledge your freedom of thought, your freedom of choice. And although it may be that everything is already owned by that supreme being, and there might be limits to the value of giving things back to the deity, at least our thoughts belong to us, and so we can offer them. And that's a way to take what you were saying and frame it a little bit more within the context of the verse. Did you follow that? Okay, good. Good. More. I'll go for somebody who hasn't spoken yet. All right, let's move forward. Here's what I thought of. And like I said, I'm not sure it's totally genuine because I know the book, so I know what comes next. So I'm not 100% sure that this doubt or this question would occur to anybody. But once you hear it, you're like, ooh, that's a good one. Just like once I heard what Shri said, I was like, that's a good one. So I want to see if you guys can see what the connection is between these two verses. I'm not going to give it away. And so I'm going to give you the verse, I'm going to read it to you, but I'm not going to flesh out the connections. And I want to see, first of all, if you can flesh out the connections, and then I want to see what your commentary is on the verse. And the verse changes meter now. It becomes tristub. It's 4 lines of 11 syllables to a line, as opposed to 4 lines of 8 syllables to a line. It's a little bit of a different verse in the Gita. It's a little bit more of a poetic meter, a little less conversational, and a little more poetic. And it lends itself well to singing. Kavim Pudana Manushashitadam Anor Aniyang Sang Anusmadedyaha Sarvasyadatadam Achintya Rupam Aditya Varnam Tamasaparastat. So the verse says, Kavim, the poet, Anusmarat, you should remember. Yaha Anusmarat, one should remember. Yaha Anusmarat, one should remember. Kavim, the poet. Puranam, the oldest. Anushashitaram, the controller. Ano Aniyangsam, that which is smaller than the smallest. Sarvasya Dataram, the one who is the maintainer of all. Achintya Rupam, who has an inconceivable form. Aditya Varnam, is luminous like the sun. Tamasa Parastat, and beyond the darkness. One should remember the poet, the oldest, the controller, that which is smaller than the smallest, maintaining everything with an inconceivable form, luminous like the sun, beyond all darkness. And this verse is actually a mashup of a couple of verses from the Upanishads, from the Katha Upanishad and the Mundaka Upanishad. These ideas, these words are in several verses from the Upanishads, and they're mashed up and condensed together into a greatest hits, and that is this verse. What is this verse's connection to the previous verse? And then once we do that, what are some ideas about this verse that come to mind?
One of my questions from the first verse was...
But I gave you a chance. I looked right at you. You didn't say anything. Why didn't you tell me what your question was?
Because I didn't want one of my questions was...
I don't believe that's a good answer. Because now you're giving the answer now. So it's like...
who is that supreme person? That's what I was wondering. In this...
Why didn't you say that?
Huh?
Why didn't you say that?
Because I thought it would just take more time.
Huh?
I thought it would take more time.
To say, I'm wondering who that supreme person is?
Yeah, because it seems like if you don't have a philosophical... I don't know. Like you said, when you looked at it, because you know the philosophy...
Did you not know what the next verse was?
No, I knew what the next verse was.
Okay.
I felt like cheating. And I felt like it was...
Okay, you felt like you were cheating.
I felt like it wasn't fair.
Okay, that's fair enough. All right, then you because you knew the next verse, you didn't want to cheat. All right, fair enough. Okay, all right, that's good. But then you're cheating now. So if you had this integrity of not wanting to cheat, then why were you unable to maintain your integrity for more than 1 minute? You still did not give anybody else a chance. So if you were going to cheat, you might as well have cheated earlier and helped me segue. Then no one had the answer, so I went ahead and set it up to challenge everybody again and give everybody another bite from the apple, and you stole that opportunity from them. All right. So regardless, I'm just going to roll with it, with this scoundrel. The last verse does not tell you who that supreme transcendent being is. This verse does. It gives you a number of words to help you think about. It says, think about the supreme divine being. How do I think about this? Like, what specific things should I think of? Tell me something about the nature of that supreme divine being. Do I just think supreme divine being, supreme divine being, supreme divine being? Do I just say those words over and over again? What does that supreme divine being look like? What are some of the qualities of that supreme divine being? Help me get a sense. And this verse does that. It gives you a number of words that are meant to indicate the nature of the deity. Now this gets a little complicated because you have vachaka and vachya. You have the words and the thing which is being described by those words. And based on semiotics, the thing which is describing, the words which are describing the thing which is being described are different. Just like you can say that the word water is a symbol. This is called semiotics, by the way, the study of symbols and their usages. So the word water is a symbol for the item water. It's not the same. So you could argue, in fact, as the Upanishads do, that all words bounce off the absolute. They can't fully convey the absolute. The absolute is beyond language. Here it says it's achintya, it's inconceivable. We're told anuchintayan, to think of, constantly think of that, but then the absolute is described as having an achintya rupam, an unthinkable form. So the first verse says anuchintayan, chint. And then this says achintya, it cannot be thought of. So certainly that is somewhat paradoxical. But there is a distinction between the vachaka and the vachya, between the words used to describe something, the terms used to describe something, and the thing which is being described. And so now we say nama nami no abed. There's no difference between the name and the named. That Krishna's name is distinct from other names in that when you say the name Krishna, you associate with Krishna. So that's true. However, there is still a sense in which, just by chanting the name of Krishna, it's not exactly the same as dancing with Krishna in the Ras Leela. Rather, the name is a bridge that brings you to the deity. The name is indispensable. It's in many ways synonymous. It is a deity in itself. Kali Kali Nama Rupe, Krishna Avatar. Krishna descends in the form of his name. And Goloka Premadhan Harinam Sankirtan, that the holy name is the treasure of Goloka Vrindavan. And Hoder Nam Eva Kevalam Kalonastyeva Gatiranyata. There's no other way in the Kali Yuga except for chanting the holy name. However, all of these terms indicate that the holy name is efficient in that it conveys you to the spiritual world. It conveys you to that abode. It brings you to Krishna. It delivers you to Krishna. It's Krishna reaching down to pull you up. But we don't find, for instance, that people describe having different rasic relationships of paternal affection towards the holy name or conjugal affection towards the holy name. We do still make a distinction between Nam, Guna, Rup, and Leela, Krishna's name, form, qualities, and pastimes. And so there is a sense in which there is Anonya Ashray. There is a mutual interdependence between the holy name and the Supreme Lord. And we stop short of saying they are exactly one in all respects. We want to say they're one and at the same time slightly different. So, we have here terms which are describing the absolute. They may have limited value. They may have, of course, in many ways they have limited value because they're not exactly the same as the Supreme Lord, but then in a lot of ways they have more value because they reach down into this world and they give you a connection. And so the holy name is simultaneously not the entirety of the Guna, Rup, and Leela, although you may be able to get to those things through the name of Krishna. But at the same time, just, do something. Don't have to leave. You came all the way down. Just do something more than you're currently doing. Especially because it's a philosophical part of the class, it's difficult for me to think of the words I want to say with too much noise. So it disturbs me enough where I actually can't keep my own train of thought. Maybe you can feed her? As a general rule, if you're a young mother and you have a child in my class and you're breastfeeding and your kid starts to make noise, breastfeed. Put a blanket over you and breastfeed. It usually works 6 times out of 7. I have a lot of experience. I can give those kind of percentages. 6 times out of 7 it will be efficacious. So, in some ways the holy name is more merciful than the Supreme Lord because it descends into this world and collects you and seduces you and attracts you. The name of Krishna is so attractive and it's empowering and it's uplifting. At the same time, that holy name is not always exactly the same as Krishna because we have statements like Bahujama Kodiyodi Shobana Kirtan Tabutana Pai Krishna Pade Premadan, that if you chant for many, many lifetimes with offenses, you will not achieve love of God. And so sometimes we acknowledge that there is some distinction between rote chanting and between actual bhakti, or between the name and the Lord who's indicated by the name. And so you have to acknowledge both things, the interdependence, the beauty of the holy name, how it's more special, how it's equivalent to, and how it's also distinct from the personality of Krishna. And that's why we choose to say things like Nam, Nami, No, Abed, that there is a non-difference between the name and the Lord, as opposed to there's a Kevala Dvaita, Nam, Nami, No. There's an absolute oneness between the two things. Or Kevala Ekatva. There's an absolute oneness between the name and the Lord. That's a little bit of a detailed, I kind of tangented off there, But the point I'm making is the verse may not fully tell you every single thing that's involved in meditating on the deity, but it's certainly a heck of a lot more than what's in the last verse. And it fills in a lot of blanks and at least gives you a springboard to start the process. And you get some cool stuff. Now let's look at the two verses together and you guys can give some feedback on them. He who meditates on me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Supreme Divine Being, his mind constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated from this path, that person is sure to reach me. If you think of the Supreme Divine Being and no other yoked to yoga by practice, you'll go there. And what is the nature of that Supreme Being? One should meditate upon the Supreme Person as the one who knows everything, Kavi. Kavi means poet, but the poets are the holders of the tradition. And so the word poet, Kavi, is synonymous with Vidvan, with the knower, is synonymous with Rishi, the seer. All these terms are used in Sanskrit to describe the self-realized soul, the person who's qualified to give exegesis and explain the scriptures and give one a vision of the absolute. They're tattvadarshi, they're seers of the truth, they're vidvan, they're learned, they are kavi, they are poets, because they describe in beautiful verses, poetic verses, that very thing, because our scriptures are written in poetry, like many scriptures of the world are written in poetry. The Hebrew Torah has many poetic sections, like the Songs of Solomon. The Quran, especially the earlier parts of the Quran, are very, very poetic in their description. And so this idea of poetry merging with spirituality is quite common. And so one should meditate on the Supreme Person as the one who knows everything. That's Kavi. As he who is the oldest, Purana. Who is the controller? Anushashitar. The Lord who is the controller. Shash is where you get the word Shastra from. The scripture, that which controls human society by giving good instructions. So he's the controller, Anushashitar. Who is smaller than the smallest, Anor Aniyangsa. Who's smaller than the smallest. The maintainer of everything, Sarvasya Datta. Beyond all material conception, that's the Achintya Rupa, an inconceivable form. Who is inconceivable and beyond all material conception. Prabhupada doubled up on that one. Achintya and Achintya Rupa. He kind of doubled up and double described it. Beyond all material conception, and who's inconceivable, who's always a person. That's imported from the last verse. The Paramam Purusham Divyam. Luminous like the sun, Aditya Varna, who's colored like the sun. Transcendental, that's Divyam. It's either from the last verse, the Divya Purusha, this divine being, or it could be from this verse, beyond the material nature. Tamasa parastat, beyond the darkness. Tamas could also be beyond matter. So it's transcendental and beyond all matter. And so it's a positive and negative way of saying the same thing. Transcendental is the positive quality. Beyond all matter is the negative quality. Even in some ways transcendental, the word trans means beyond. And so it also indicates the same via negativa idea that the Lord is beyond this world. Just another way of saying the same thing. Prabhupada doubles up on a couple of the items here. So now we have two verses. Give me some feedback. Yes?
Why is smaller than the smallest in there?
That's a natural question, right? Why would the Lord not be called greater than the greatest? King of kings, Lord of lords, God of gods, Most High, supreme transcendent being, supreme ruler above all other rulers. That type of language is much more commonplace, especially in these Semitic traditions, meaning Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but even in the Indic traditions. Move them up, tell them to be quiet, tell the adults it's their job. especially in the Semitic traditions, it's absolutely like that's it. That's all you get is what I just said. But even in the Indic traditions, this is still unusual. It's from the Upanishads, but it's unusual. Smaller than the smallest. It seems to be a diminutive description. It seems to indicate a lacking in the Lord. Right? And so that definitely warrants thought. For sure. That's a natural doubt. And this is actually what I want to talk about today. We, generally speaking, we practice the principle of invidious contrast. We, in a very obscene way, we imagine that the world, half of the world is good and half of the world is bad. Therefore, God is male and he is not. Come on, guys. All I really require at this point is a basic knowledge of the English language. There should be no lack, unless you're totally not paying attention or you're just being willfully obstinate. God is male, therefore he's not. There you go. God is white, therefore he's not. God is old, therefore he's not. You get it? God's absolute, therefore he's not. Relative. God is the cause, therefore he's not an effect. God is active, therefore he's not passive. You follow? God is dominant, therefore he's not submissive. The problem with embracing this natural tendency to think of the world in binary terms and ascribe one quality to God and negate the other is you end up with a crippled notion of divinity. And if you're going to get into seeing God as a person, you have to start doing fine theology. If you imagine God as a force, you can get away with a lot more vagueness. But when you start to embrace and deal with and wrestle with the idea of God being a person, you have to be a much finer thinker. Because the tendency is to begin to think of God in anthropomorphic terms. Unnecessarily, being a person does not mean being a human being. That's anthropomorphism, to imagine that the only thing that qualifies as a person or an individual is a human being. And to imagine that if God was a person, he would have to have all the same faults you had is an extreme version of anthropomorphism, where you're unable to conceive of someone who could have a form but not be limited by that form. Someone who could be youthful but also be eternal. Someone who could have both masculine and feminine aspects and be truly androgynous. Someone who could be in the hearts of all and also beyond this world. Someone who could be the absolute source of all creation and at the same time available relatively, because relativity is the backbone of empathy, which is the backbone of compassion, which is the backbone of grace, which is the backbone or another form of love. And so when you start to argue that God's absolute, not relative, what you really are ultimately saying is God is incapable of empathy, compassion, love, and grace. And you start to end up with a very robotic and incomplete conception of divinity. Push to the left side. That's the right side. Push to the left side. There you go. Did you guys follow this? So this verse forms an Upanishadic core of a subversive, anachronistic, out-of-the-box conception of divinity that challenges this dividing of the world into good and evil in a binary us versus them, good versus bad way. Being smaller than the smallest is also an opulence. It means you can pervade everything. And if simultaneously you're Sarvasya Datta, the maintainer of all, and you're Anushashitar, you're the controller of all, then we've already said you're the bigger than the biggest. So it says Anushashitar, Anornyangsam, and then Sarvasya Datta. He's the maintainer of all, he's the controller of all, and he's smaller and more subtle than everything. And so what you have here in the Upanishads, it's the first instance of what's called apophatic theology, a term which was just come up with in the West in the last 150 years, where you begin to think of God as being, and also it's an example of panentheism, also a term which is merely 150 years old, 170 years old in this country. We're just catching up with these ideas which were well understood thousands of years ago, but Western philosophy and theology is just now catching up with this idea. So via negativa theology, neti, also called apophatic theology, is when you describe God by way of negation. You don't just say what God is, you say what God is not. So a theologian, for instance, a theologian doing cataphatic theology, that's what we're most familiar with, would say God exists. Apophatic theology, a theologian would say God does not exist. What he means is God does not exist in the same way that you or I exist as a contingent being which could exist or could not exist and is dependent on forces greater than itself. So when we say God exists, don't get mistaken and think God is just like you. That's anthropomorphic. You're thinking of God in your own image. Rather, you have to embrace the idea that God exists and God does not exist. And then they give him fancy, they go, God does not exist. And they start really forcing you to think through a conception of divinity so that you don't cripple it with mundane notions of what's possible, with your limited power of thought that bounces off the absolute but doesn't really communicate it. And so these paradoxical statements, we need to anuchintayan, think of constantly the person who has an achintya rupa, an inconceivable form, a form that cannot be thought of. Anuchintayan achintya rupam. You constantly think of that person that cannot be thought of. And so these ideas force you to go beyond your limited conceptions of what's possible and begin to slip out of your mind into transcendence. They're logical and they're translogical. So we find some standard some standard stuff, the controller of all the oldest, right? But then it's immediately contrasted with, we also say Krishna is Navayovanam Cha. He's also young and fresh. But here it says he's smaller than the smallest. And that indicates the opulence of things which normally you don't think of as being good. Krishna says in the Gita, Kamosmi, I am desire. Normally we think of kama as being like the worst thing. It's like the source of everything bad in Sanskrit. It's the closest thing you get. Avidya and kama, the desire and ignorance, are the closest thing you get to evil in Vedic literatures. But Krishna says, that I am desire, which is, and I'm strength. I'm strength, which is kama vivarjita, which is devoid of desire. And I'm even desire, which is dharma aviruddha, which is not contrary to dharma. And so Krishna's taking an idea that I am strength, but sometimes strength can be used in a bad way. Okay, I'm strength free from ego and desire. Okay, well then where do you get desire from? No, I'm also desire. If it's dharma aviruddha, not contrary to dharma. And so Krishna's trying to give you a worldview where everything in creation has its place in the absolute, and Krishna is the alpha and the omega, the beginning, middle, and end of all things, the creator and the destroyer, where everything in the world has a purpose, where everything in the world has goodness, where everything in the world can be properly utilized. And that idea that most religions would agree to, at least if they're non-dualistic, which is, 5 billion people in the world have a dualistic religious view where there's heaven and hell and God and the devil. A famous actor slapped somebody in front of the whole world recently, committed battery. And then one of his friends said, the devil made him do it. Which is like a really, easy way to just free yourself from all personal responsibility. It's like there's some devil sitting on your shoulder. Everything bad you do, it's the devil. It wasn't me, it was the devil. It's a really disempowering worldview. And it's just so common. Like people just spit it out. It's just in any way intellectually respectable or reasonable to postulate such a thing, and how it exonerates you from any personal responsibility. And if let's say there is a devil trying to make you do something, then you still have the power to not do it, so it's still your fault. So why bring up somebody there's always temptations. Why bring up the temptations all the time? Why just talk about your personal responsibility? You follow? There's some sense in which even by invoking that, even if you say, oh no, but you can resist it, by invoking it in the first place, you're bringing it up that it's something that's the ultimate cause. And you're not taking responsibility. You're trying to lay off a bunch of the blame. Anyway, so what you find here is a non-dualistic worldview where everything has value and you can see the beauty in all things, and you can start to think about God as more subtle than the subtlest, as smaller than the smallest, as younger than the youngest, and older than the oldest. And that's why he has an inconceivable form, because all of these things which are very difficult to conceive of from our limited perspective, there's no logical reason why these things wouldn't adhere naturally in various forms in an absolute source of all creation. And so we can start with these ideas, these Upanishadic ideas, and they gradually lead us to things like appreciating the relativity of the absolute. Here's a radical one. Is God perfect? Perfect means there's no room for growth. So then perfect would mean static. And imperfect would mean capable of further growth. But what about the idea that divinity is perfect and capable of growth? It's certainly mathematically possible to add to infinity. Why can't God be perfect and become more perfect at every moment? Become infinitely more perfect at every moment. These ideas are challenging. They make sense. They're logical, but they're translogical. And they take you beyond the general fetters and limitations and shackles of your mind and start to help you get a little closer to the absolute. Even if ultimately grace is required to help you bump the hump completely, we have to do our part and be empowered. And this verse gives us a way to begin to do that. There's positive and negative, aditya varna, luminous like the sun, tamasa parasa, beyond the darkness. There's these contrapositioning of positive and negative statements. The achintya rupa, but you're supposed to think of it at all times. He's the controller and the maintainer, but he's smaller than the smallest. Subtle enough that if you don't want to see him, you won't. That's another one. If love exists, love requires free will. Free will means God can't be so present that you couldn't turn away from him, and therefore he'd have to be smaller than the smallest. Otherwise, he'd be too in your face at every moment, and you wouldn't be able to do the wrong thing. It's an interesting thing, but if you follow your conscience, if you listen, like Shakespeare said, the earth makes music for those that would hear. The earth makes music for those that would hear. And so there is divinity in the world if you're listening for it, if you're looking for it, if you're open to it, if you're seeking it. Not in a confirmation bias, knowledge filter type way, but there's actual evidence for it. But the evidence isn't so grotesque that you can't weasel out of it and get away from it and turn away. If the evidence was so undeniable, then there'd be no free will. The ramifications of your actions would be too in your face for you to do the wrong thing. Like nobody breaks the law when there's a police officer standing right there next to him. Forgetfulness is a blessing from divinity because it gives you the freedom to turn away. God's being subtle and small and within everything, but not in your face, too big that you can't ignore him, is another element of God's grace. Your conscience can help you. Krishna will help you. So many times in my life, Krishna saved me from myself. So many times. Uncountable times. Undeniable amount of times. In an undeniable amount of ways. With absolute, Krishna's reached down multiple times in my life and pulled me out of a bad situation. Magically. Miraculously. And so I make it a point to always listen to the voice of my conscience, to always listen for Krishna's validation and approval, along with using my God-given intelligence. But if you turn away from that, that voice gets quieter. The voice of your conscience gets quiet because you don't want Krishna around. He's a person. He doesn't want to be there if you don't want him there. He doesn't want to, force you to do something you don't want to do. And so for those people who are sincere, Krishna becomes more and more prevalent in their life, more and more active in their life, louder and louder in their life. And contrasting, if you don't want that, despite the excellent arguments we have, the excellent, logical, reasonable, coherent, philosophical arguments we have for the existence of God, people still find a way to turn away. And support for that position. Enough that they can dumb themselves down and stupefy themselves. And anything less than that would be a world without free will, therefore a world without love. And it would also be deficient. And so what happens when you read verses like this is it's like the red pill. It starts you down this road where you begin to think more creatively and in a less crippled way about the nature of divinity. And it provides you with a schema, with a map, with a legend, with some ideas, with some stimuli, with a springboard that you can spend your whole life filling in. More? More feedback? So to wrap it all up, we got a verse. What's the verse says? Abhyasa yoga yuktena. Chetasa, with your mind, yoked to yoga through practice. You got to work at it. Nanyagamina, not going anywhere else. What you should do, what you should not do. Positive and negative. Right? Paramam Purusham Divyam Anuchintayan. Think of that supreme divine person, Yati, and you'll go there. How do I think of that supreme divine person? How do I do that? Kavim Puranam, Anushashitaram, as the controller, as the oldest, as eternal, as the knower of all, as the poet. Anor and the Youngtam, as smaller than the smallest. And that one really blows your mind. Sarvasya Datta, as the maintainer of all. Achinta Rupam, with an inconceivable form. Wait a second, I'm supposed to think of him, Anuchinta, but then he's Achintya, he can't be thought of. Right? Aditya Varnam, luminous like the sun. Okay, I'll think of that. Tamasa Prastap, beyond the darkness. Positive, negative. Cataphatic, apophatic. Via positiva, via negativa. God is the biggest, God is the smallest, and everything in between. And you're getting the beginning of a really complete conception of divinity, where we have all the beauty of being a person with none of the deficiencies. Of all the beauty of being a person's capable of love. If God was a non-person, there'd be no love. Love is the attribute of a person. Where do you ever find love floating around? As it's like sometimes you'll find like carbon floating around in the universe. Where do you ever find love floating around the universe? Love is always the attribute of an individual. It's the result of free will, the conscious application of free will and desire. A deity devoid of that individuality is also devoid of the capacity for love. And you start to think about this stuff and work it out over years, over decades, over lifetimes. And these texts become a pointer in that direction of a rich, full, internal life of meditation on the Supreme Being. Even the idea of God being a being is radical. Even that idea is radical. Even that's a dangerous idea. People think, saying, Tattvamasi, you are that, or something like that is like a big deal. That's easy stuff. Conceiving of God as a person without conceiving God as being necessarily a person just like you, that's some fine thinking. And so you've got all that in these verses. It's a real springboard. It's very, very rich. Really rich stuff. And a pair of verses from the Gita. Let's do a little kirtan. Thank you so much.